Hi, I'm Dr. Katie McKnight. Welcome to my session on literacy and learning centers for the big kids, grades 4 through 12. And I'm really happy that you're here. My contact information is below, and I'm hanging out in the chat area live. So if you have any questions along the way, I'm very, very happy to answer them for you. And also resources too. I have tons and tons of resources to share. There's a little bit about me. I started my career in education over 30 years ago, which I sometimes have to remind myself of that. And I started teaching in Chicago, and I was also a professor at a university for about 15 years and culminated that career as a distinguished professor of research. And then I founded Engaging Learners, which is an organization that works on raising student achievement in schools. And I developed the Literacy and Learning Center model that I'm going to share with you in this session based on that work in schools. So this model, its genesis is from classrooms just like yours. Why should we use centers for older students? Well, let me talk for a moment about the difference between stations and centers, because I know that the term station, rotation stations or station rotations, things like that come up, and that the way that elementary teachers define them. So when I say centers, it's a opportunity for students to collaborate. And I deliberately called them centers because we're deep diving into content, and it seemed to be a more appropriate term for what the purpose is behind this instructional model. But I want students to use their literacy skills to really start deep diving into content, the discipline specific courses that we have with the older grades. So that's why it's really that's why I decided to use that term centers over stations. So I wanted to make that clarification, because sometimes folks look at this and they'll say, oh, well, that looks like stations. And some may say that, but really how, instructionally and what the learning task is, it actually makes more sense to use that term. So why should we use centers for older students? Well, the first is the idea of gradual release of responsibility, or self-regulated learning, of kids working more independently on their skills and developing content knowledge. And then differentiated instruction. And of course, we're coming out of the end of our global pandemic, and differentiated instruction and meeting the individual needs of students is more important than it ever was before, because everybody's has had different experiences, whether it's hybrid, in person, all virtual kinds of learning. Our kids are coming back in the fall in all different kinds of places. So differentiated instruction has always been paramount, but even more so. And I always say that, the COVID-19 pandemic, what it did is that challenges that we've had as educators that have always vexed us have just intensified as a result of the pandemic. And then I also, it really addresses to the model makes sense for brain-based learning. One of a very, really interesting statistic is that middle school students actually need to more, let me try that again. Middle school students need to move more than elementary students or kindergartners in particular to learn. And that's a gob-stopping kind of statistic. To learn more about brain-based learning for adolescent students, a book that I highly recommend is Sarah Jane Blakemore's book. And her book on adolescent learning is really fantastic. And I'll put that link to that in a chat. But she's her neuroscience research is really has some groundbreaking implications for us as educators. And then the idea of gradual release of responsibility. I'm sure many of you are familiar with it, but the I do, we do together, or guided practice, and then you do is very much a part of this model, of the Literacy and Learning Center model. And I'll go into that in detail. So in this slide. And what we know with gradual release of responsibility, the I do part, that modeling, is the mini lesson or whole group instruction. So I'm going to do a mini lesson, It could be something like a think aloud as a science teacher, where I'm thinking aloud about a science article and sharing with students how I read that article as a scientist. As a social studies teacher, it could be what I'm doing if I'm sourcing a document and I'm showing students how to source a document. And then we do it together is that pair small group, the guided instruction. So we've just learned how to source a document. Now we're going to practice doing it in pairs or small groups. That's the we do it. And then you do it is in the centers. That gets to be more independent work. And so I might have a center about sourcing a primary source document as a social studies teacher. So that I do, we do, you do is directly parallel with the literacy and learning center structure. And we're going to go more into that and how do I actually create this with my students. So literacy and learning centers, teachers can create learning activities that involve student choice, flexible grouping, and modification of skills. And those are the cornerstones of differentiated instruction. So I always say when I'm working in classrooms and providing professional learning, professional development in schools and school districts, is let's just focus on the instructional model right now. And brain-based brain-based learning, differentiated instruction, formative assessment, without going into it in great detail, you can see where all of that fits just naturally into this model. So I always assert that if you follow the model that you implement the Literacy and Learning Center, all of that comes into play. So you can have blended learning, integrate technology, differentiating instruction, gradual release of responsibility, and formative assessment. All of it is foundational to this model. Okay, so let's get into the structure. How do I actually do this? And the pictures that you're seeing in the presentation on my slides are all from classrooms that I have been able to collaborate with colleagues and work with other educators just like you. And they're middle school and high school classrooms. So I said at the onset of the presentation is that this model really comes from a genuine need of what teachers and students need in their classroom to be successful in integrating the literacy skills with the development of content knowledge and disciplinary knowledge. So I said before, the I do part is that mini lesson. It's direct instruction. I'm showing my kids how to do something, and it should be no longer than 12 to 14 minutes. And it introduces a skill or maybe content knowledge. So one of the things to bear in mind with the mini lesson is that if it starts extending beyond like 15, 16 minutes, with older high school students, it's not really a mini lesson anymore. It really needs to be that kind of chunk. So one of the things that we need to do when we're designing mini lessons is make sure that have a strong focus of concentration that's driving that mini lesson, and that it really can be taught in 15 minutes. So I'm going to go back to that social studies example is that if I'm sourcing a document, I have specific questions that I'm going to ask. I model that for my students. I for sure can do that in 12 to 14 minutes. As an ELA teacher, maybe I'm teaching about the difference between a flat character and a round character. So if the students have already had an introduction to characterization, then I can talk about the differences between a flat character or a round character. Or maybe today I just introduce a flat character, and then tomorrow I introduce a round character, what that is. So make sure that it really is in that 12 to 14 minutes. And so the Literacy and Learning Center cycle, that first step is the mini lesson. And then what comes next is the guided practice. And then we're going to go into center activities. So oftentimes what I see happen is that we'll do the big overview, the 2 days of professional development on the whole Literacy and Learning Center model. And then I start visiting classrooms and team teaching and modeling and such. And the mini lesson and the guided practice gets forgotten. It's just kids immediately go into centers. And remember, we've got to prime the pump. So just going into the mini lesson or the guided practice or going into the centers before you do the mini lesson and guided practice, we didn't really prime the pump. So trust me, it's so important to have those two components before we get to those center activities. So what exactly is that mini lesson? So as I said before, it's short, it's focused, it's chunked and incorporates modeling. And if you look in your handout, you'll see that I have an example mini lesson. So where do I get material for that? I would suggest that you already have a huge amount of resources, lessons, things that you do. Pull out those file cabinets or look in that hard drive and start pulling out those things and making sure that they're chunked. But I shared in the handout an example of a really effective reading comprehension strategy. It happens to be one of my favorite reading comprehension strategies. It's called sticky notes, and using that in as a mini lesson really teaches kids how to be active readers with text. And then the next step is the guided practice. So we want students to practice the skill or engage with the content that was introduced in the mini lesson. So if I just taught about characterization and flat characters and round characters, maybe I want the students to do a character analysis or a graphic organizer looking at different characters from a story or a novel that we're reading, and have them analyze it and looking and applying those characteristics from that literary device into an actual text. And so students can work independently, individually, or they can work in pairs. Pairs and triads seem to work best. And they're going to keep practicing that specific skill or review specific content that was introduced in the mini lesson. And then as a teacher, I'm going around and I'm working the classroom and checking for students' understanding. So here's another example in a math class. Is that I was in a math class, this was pre-pandemic. It was actually in Arizona and Mesa. And it was a math class, and the students were working on finding the area of shapes, multiple component shapes. So it was like a rectangle and a triangle, and students had to, find the rectangle first, then the triangle, and add those together in a step-by-step process. And so the teacher modeled it, and then the students were given some problems to work on in triads, and they were working on that. And then that gives me an opportunity as I'm walking around the classroom and seeing how the students are doing on these different problems, how they're understanding these concepts and being able to apply what they know about finding different areas of, for instance, a triangle, a rectangle, a circle, and combining those in order to determine the actual area of these complex shapes. So then we get into the center activities. And in the center activities, students work together to practice that skill or engage with the content knowledge. And there's always a clearly articulated activity, a point of concentration, a point of focus. And then I always encourage folks to make sure that you have a teacher-led center as well. And as one teacher, Lauren, she said to me, when she was implementing centers, I said, what would you say to your colleague who's a little nervous about the teacher-led center? Because I find that when we first start doing literacy and learning centers, some of my colleagues will get nervous about it, and because they're afraid that if they're in the teacher-led center, that the rest of the class is going to go nuts. And Lauren said, actually, that's like the bread and butter. That's like the heartbeat of literacy and learning centers, because it's my opportunity to work with my students in a small group. And if my centers are going well and I've built those habits with my students, they can definitely work independently. I see first graders, second grade teachers, third grade teachers, kindergarten teachers teach kids how to work in centers with independence while they're at a teacher-led center. There's no reason why we can't do it in middle school and high school. Here's how middle school students and high school students are really not that different. It's about building those habits. So if your students are off task or they're not following directions, we just do a simple 1, 2, 3, eyes on me. Hey, I'm stopping everybody right now because I want to remind you of what the center norms are. And the center norms is that we're focused and that we're all working together on this learning task. Right now, I see folks kind of, not paying attention and they're distracted. So let's get refocused and do that. 20 minutes later, they do the same thing. 1, 2, 3, eyes on me, and then remind them of the norms. We don't want our students to keep practicing bad habits, or I shouldn't say bad, that's judgmental, undesirable habits. And we want to keep reinforcing those good habits. And it does work. I have paired with teachers and worked in classrooms that are some of our most challenging in the United States, and where colleagues will say, "Oh, Dr. McKnight, you know, you don't understand our kids. I don't know how we're going to be able to do this." And it works like magic. And I can share in the chat right now this wonderful video of a classroom that I worked with in Illinois. And it's one of the most challenging environments. I think something like right now it's about 20% of the students at the middle school level are meeting or exceeding state expectations on the standardized state test. And you'll see this classroom and what can happen, but it's about our expectations, making sure that we clearly articulate them, and that we keep reinforcing them over and over and over again in a non-judgmental way. Hey, I'm stopping everybody right now because there's too much noise, there's too much side chatter. So let's get control of our voices. Let's remember we're supposed to be at about a level 1, level 2 voice, and continue. And you just keep doing that. I do webinars and things just specifically focusing on classroom management. And if you sign up for my newsletter at KatieEngageLearners.com, you'll have up-to-date information on that and resources. I also have a Centers Norm poster that I can share with you too. If you sign up for my newsletter, I always share those pieces of information or those resources. And so what do students exactly do in a center? Well, students work in small groups, and the general rule is no less than 3, no more than 5. Okay, so no less than 3 students. If you have less than 3 students, then students just kind of work individually. They work, you know, they don't so much interact. Each center has a very clearly articulated learning activity. So and that learning activity relates back to the skill or the content that was introduced in the mini lesson. Oftentimes, sometimes we're going to go back and practice or review a skill. That happens a lot in mathematics. And making sure that students have prerequisite skills before they move on to the next task. The other thing that I'm asked all the time too is that well, let me add, if you have more than 5, what happens is that the group tends to break off and then you wind up with 2 groups. So keep them 3 to 5. And if you have a class that's like 26, 27 students, there's ways of setting it up where you can just duplicate centers. So you have carbon copies, so it doesn't increase your prep. I'll explain that in a moment. But the other thing that I'm asked too is how long should the center be? Well, what we know from neuroscience is that our students generally, and this is for everybody, not just our students, is that your attention span is generally your chronological age times 1. Okay, so I just turned 55 in April, and so my attention span should be 55. Now, this hasn't changed because of technology. It's the way we always have been. So if you think back when you were in college or you've been in a meeting or maybe even on this webinar, you know, you start drifting off. You need that brain break, and our students are no different. So if I'm teaching freshmen, it should generally be about 14 minutes. If I have seniors, I'm going to go 17 to 18 minutes. That's the outside limit. So I always say keep them like around 12 to 15 minutes. The other thing that we know from learning is that when there's a little bit of positive pressure, that students will perform better, that they actually are going to be more attentive to task. Okay. So, and then the other thing too is I want to remind you too is that make sure that you have directions written out. I cannot emphasize this enough, how important it is to write out the directions for the students for the task. And I'll give you an example. There was a 5th grade classroom, and I was in this 5th grade classroom, and I visited the teacher. Her name's Barbara. And she looks at me and she's like, Dr. McKnight, it didn't go nearly as well as I wanted it to, and da 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 da. And I said, okay, so let's break it down. Let's see what happened. And then it was her prep period. So she had already done centers the previous period. We had a prep debriefing, and then she was going to do the same lesson again, same activities. So I said, so how did you give the directions to the students? She said, well, I told them. Well, here's the thing with directions, with verbal directions. If I have a class of 25 kids, the first time I give directions, maybe 15 of the kids heard them. And then by the second time I give the directions of the original 15, 14 of them already forgot them. So write them out, make sure they're clearly articulated, and that the students know that as soon as they go to the center that they need to read the directions. So if you look at this picture, actually, and next to that blue plastic folder bin, you can see that there's directions right there. And this particular teacher, her name's Adrian, she this is a 7th grade classroom in New Mexico. She just pastes them on a piece of cardboard because she wants to emphasize that those are the directions, and it makes it easier when kids are moving things around, that cardboard, the directions are mounted on cardboard, and they're easier to find for the students. So we want group size, we want to give choice, and that's a tenet of differentiated instruction. We know from research that the more we give students choice, the more motivated and engaged they're going to be. So I always say, give choice when you can. So if I have a vocabulary center, I might give the students an option of doing 2 different vocabulary activities. If we're going to source primary source documents, when they go to that center, they may have a choice of maybe 3 or 4 different articles, and they choose which article that they're going to source. And then timing. So as I mentioned, think chronological age times 1. That's how long the center should be. What I find over and over again is that when we go over that kind of threshold, what happens is then students start getting off task. And then I always recommend posting a timer in class. So if you go to my YouTube channel, there's all kinds of teacher tips, teachers just like you who give tips on things like timers, how to move students around, giving students choice, all of those. And if you'd like, I can put the link in the chat area right now while we're looking at the content. So I'll put that in there and you can look at those teacher tips. And then a makeup center. And that's also a tenet of differentiated instruction. So it's not where 7th grade girls fix their mascara or such. It's actually an opportunity for students to revise any work that they may have not completed. So the makeup center, everybody does that at the same time is the way that I do it. Some colleagues of mine do it a little differently, and I'll explain that in a moment. But that makeup center, students have rotated through all the centers. So if they didn't finish something at a center, they'll have an additional time to do that and finish it up. No matter how hard I try to get the center's time perfectly, I always, run into those glitches. So if you have a makeup center, that allows for that. Some teachers also allow students at the makeup center, or my colleague Adrian, she refers to it as the reflection center, that they can also continue on any reading. They can go back and revise any work. I also like to use it as a quick formative assessment. If the students have finished everything, I say, I want you to pull out your best work and explain to me why it's your best work, and the work that challenged you the most, and explain to me why you think that work was more challenging. And that's a good formative assessment for me to figure out where my students are. What Adrienne does is that she has a list. So when students go to the makeup center, she says, first thing is finish up any work that, or finish up any work that you did at the centers, that you were unable to finish at the centers. Number 2, do your independent reading. Number 3, you can complete any work that is missing from this class. Number 4, you can complete any work that's missing from any of your other classes. And she has a list of like 10 items. So it never becomes a thing at the makeup center of like, what do I do? Or I don't know what to do, or I've done everything. We know as educators that there's always something that students can use, and use that time wisely and effectively. Okay. And then of course, procedures. Those are those center norms, your expectations for your students. So I want to talk more in greater detail about the foundational centers. Here's the beauty of this, okay, is that it's about chunking instruction, making sure that you have your mini lesson, the I do part, we do, and then you do. And as long as it's chunked and there's a clearly articulated focus for learning and instruction, you're good. And so I have complete faith. So these are always suggested centers for you to do. They're not mandatory. So no one knows your students better than you do. And so, so please make sure that if you have to adjust, then adjust. The first is that teacher-led center. And what do I do at the teacher-led center? I'll go into in just a moment. And then a reading together center, vocabulary, and then writer's craft. Even for mathematics, I suggest these 4 foundational centers. And I'm going to go more in depth in a moment. So the teacher-led centers, at the teacher-led center, I'm having conferences with students, either small groups or individually. It's also my opportunity that if students might be struggling with something or they need extra support, I can provide it at that point. I like to use proficiency scales, rubrics that really focus on this development of skills and the content knowledge, and using formative assessment strategies and checks for understanding and descriptive feedback. We know from John Hattie's work and many others, Jim Popham, Margaret Heritage, that on the spot descriptive feedback is probably one of the most impacting things that we can do as teachers. It positively impacts student performance more than anything else that we do. But descriptive feedback, let me give a cautionary, is never in the form of a letter grade or a percentage. It's about here's what you're doing well, or here's what you're is very effective. Here's what you need to work on. And so that teacher-led center and giving students descriptive feedback is really huge. I was in a classroom in Florida about 2 years ago, and I was working with a teacher who taught AP language, and she was working with her students and in a teacher-led center, and she was specifically focusing on making sure that students understood the rhetorical devices of logos, pathos. And so she would go into greater depth and would pull out the students' writing and say, here's where you're doing this, here's where you're doing that. It's not enough to give the definition, but we have to connect it and explain how the writer is using that rhetorical technique of ethos, pathos, and logos to develop the content or develop the text and the message. And it was just fascinating to watch her students, because as they were listening to her and listening to each other's examples, it of course deepens their understanding. And we know this from writers' workshop and such, but what vexes us and what's challenging oftentimes for us as teachers is that when you have 25, 30, I've been in classrooms as large as 37, 40 students, how do you make that happen? And that's where the structure can really be beneficial. That's how you can make it happen. I've done centers actually in Indiana in a class with 42 students. It was a science class, and Brooke and I were hustling in that class. Let me tell you about that. And then reading together, choice, giving kids choice as much as you possibly can is motivating, and it makes a big difference in student motivation. And then the other thing too is grouping students by choice, not by ability. And let me talk about that for a moment. Is that when I was a baby teacher, we were taught that putting students in heterogeneous groups was really effective, that you had a high student, low student, more gregarious student, more introvert, et cetera. And what we know, and if you think about Vygotsky's work in zone of proximal development, is that when we're more aligned, or there is a focus of skills that are similar, that it actually is more conducive to learning. So, so let's start looking at grouping students by choice, not so much by ability. So one of the things that works really well, it's very motivating. I can tell you about a classroom I was in Alexandria, Virginia, and we had 3 texts, and we were looking at cause and effect, and the students had their choice between 3 different articles to read. and we grouped them based on their choice. And the teacher said to me, she said she never had seen the students so engaged and interested, but they were applying what they were learning about cause and effect to those different articles, and much more motivated to actually read and engage in the text. And then of course, text complexity model is about and it's in the Arizona state standards, is about it's a three-part model. So it's reader and task considerations, qualitative dimensions, and then the quantitative measurement of text. So text is not just all Lexile score. It actually, background knowledge, why you're reading that text has a huge impact on motivation and the complexity of that text. Okay, and then we go to vocabulary. So vocabulary and background knowledge equals text complexity. Visualizing words and meanings, internalizing language, and math teachers need to have a vocabulary center too, more so than any other content area. If a student doesn't know what the word factor means, then they're done. They can't proceed. And math vocabulary is often in isolation. Like, the students need to know what those standalone terms mean in order to execute the problem solving that they're being prompted to do. So vocabulary, 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 even in the math class. And that would be a whole other presentation to do. But the most ineffective way for us to teach vocabulary is having students write the words 3 to 5 times and writing down definitions. The research on vocabulary is very clear that that doesn't work. Vocabulary, language development, including grammar, works best when you're able to integrate it within the course of study, within the actual lesson. That's actually the most effective way that we start internalizing vocabulary, and it starts becoming part of our idiolect. And then the last foundational center is writing. So working on writing that's applicable to the content. So if I'm sourcing a primary source document, I might be writing an extended response about how that document is being sourced. If I'm in a science class, working on my data reporting or lab report skills might be in the writer's craft. In mathematics, I might be looking at a case study and or an extended response. And of course, I could be doing a literary analysis or an informative piece or evidence-based argumentation in an ELA class. Okay, and then beyond the foundational centers, so you know your students and you know your content better than anybody else. So these are the 4 major content areas of ELA, social studies, math, and science. Here's some additional examples of what you can do with centers. So I have my 4 foundational centers, and then I might add some based on the content. So reading alone, so reading independently, speaking and listening, so debating a topic or discussing something, visualization, where I might be creating a visual of content that I'm studying. So some guidelines for content specific centers. There is not one way to create center activities. So we want to give students opportunities to practice skills, engage with new content. And then we want to chunk our content. Remember, we want to keep those centers, somewhere around 12 to 15 minutes. Remember that student attention span equals age times 1. And be sure teams can do the activity independently. So we want to make sure that we're setting them up for success. So those written directions, lots of examples, and having kids work independently. And then don't reinvent the wheel. I'm certain of it that you have tons of materials that are on hard drives or in file cabinets, et cetera, that you already have. How can you take what you already have and chunk it and work it within this model? And that's what a lot of teachers will say to me too, is that they went into their resources and their materials and they started looking for things that they've done, and we're able to adapt materials to use for mini lessons, guided practice, and also for centers and independent learning. So here's what happens, after we introduce centers and we start going into it in classrooms and implementing it, is that teachers will say things to me like, I'll say, how's it going? What are you noticing about your students? And here's what they always say, and it doesn't matter the context. It could be one of the most high performing schools, it could be one of the lowest performing schools, is that teachers will report that they're surprised at how focused the students have become. And it's really because we're chunking and we have a clearly defined articulated focus. We're able to cover more content actually, and skill development in centers. A Spanish teacher I know, she said that her assessments, the averages started going up as soon as she started implementing centers. And she said it's because the students just have more practice time. And then she said, then they also report too is that I can individually work with students in centers. Honestly, I'm surprised at how effective learning centers can be in the middle and high school classroom. I'm a pragmatic. I've been in education. I've been an educator for over 30 years in higher education. I was a classroom teacher for over a decade at the middle school and high school level. And I'm in classrooms all over the world. And here's what I find over and over and over again is that this model came from a need. And over the 10 years since I've been doing literacy and learning centers and developing the model, is that it's really just keeps getting revised and reshaped because of teachers like you who offer feedback and suggestions on what they've done that works well. So to give you an example, and again, if you go to my YouTube channel, and I'll put the link in the chat area. It's also in the handout. If you go to my YouTube channel, there's all kinds of teacher tips there, and they're from teachers just like you. So one teacher will talk about how they organize materials. Another teacher shares how they use a cup system. So the students have cups at their different centers. A red cup means we can't go any further. We're confused. We don't know what to do. A yellow cup means we can get started, but we have a question as soon as you're able to, talk to us. A green cup means, hey, we're good. We got this. We don't need any help. And then a blue cup means that they're finished. And then students can start self-regulating and work independently. They know that you're there in case they need you, but they really do need to start developing greater independence because that's what leads to college and career readiness, particularly in middle school and high school. And then the movement too, when they go from center to center, and you have that timer, it gives them that break, and then they know they're going on to the next task. So that's the other thing too. But that this really does come from need. It comes from classrooms just like yours, and being able to develop those literacy skills with the content knowledge in the disciplines as well, and being effective. So there's my contact information. I'm always really happy to support you in any way that I can. Again, sign up for my newsletter, which is at KatieEngageLearners.com. And my newsletter there, I don't sell my newsletter list or anything else. It's for our community. And so I'll send you information about, presentation engagements, where I'm speaking, free webinars, as well as free resources. And then my Facebook page is pretty busy. Katie McKnight Literacy, we're always posting rich content there as well. Lots of resources for you as well. And then also feel free to drop me a line at Gmail, and get KatieEngageLearners@gmail.com. I've also written 2 books. There are the titles of my 2 books. That first one, that blue book, is about how to get started with centers. So a lot of what I've shared in the presentation today and more information, more differentiated book lists, for example, are there. And then that orange book is filled with different activities, center activities, mini lessons that you can use. So it gets into, really specific things like, how 4 vocabulary activities that you can do at a vocabulary center and such. And that's what the orange book is.